As a professor of German and someone who's in the Department of European Languages and Studies, I want to talk about learning a foreign language. So how many of you in the audience do speak a second language? Wow, that's a lot. That's really fantastic. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of German. How many of you know German? Fewer, but a couple. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of German tonight. So first of all, why would one learn a foreign language? Well, if you go to Google, what it will tell you is there are a number of reasons to learn a foreign language. For your holidays, for example. Statistically, evidently, if the scientist, linguist can tell me if this is true, statistically, it slows the onset of memory loss. Whoa, I'm not sure what happens. It's good for professional life. We live in an increasingly global world, so it's good to learn a foreign language there. Also, it helps improve multitasking, which we all have to do in our lives anyway. Now, why did I learn German? It was not really for most of those reasons. I learned German because there was a language requirement when I went to college, so I had to take a foreign language. Why German? Well, I was going to be a physicist. And back in the day when I was in college, which was long ago that I'd like to think, I don't know why this keeps on going out here, but back when I was in college, I thought I was going to be a physicist, and to be a physicist, you had to know German, Russian, or French. So I started with German. After all, so many great physicists are Germans. And then at one point, I just had an act of will. I made the commitment to actually learn the language, not just to get an A in the course, but to really learn it. And then I started reading the literature, and I just fell in love with it. And I traveled and lived abroad after college, and it just opened my mind and to a whole world of new experiences, and it made me look at the world and myself in a completely different way. So if I really wanted to summarize that in some sense, I might say, well, you learn a foreign language because it makes you smarter, or it makes you more educated. Now, why the scare quotes around those things? Well, I think now it's time to learn a little bit of German, because I think education is more complicated than we think. Education for me is not just the acquisition or manipulation of information. Machines can do that. Education is not so much training in a technical field. That's very important. Education is not just what goes on in a classroom, right? Rather, education is Bildung. There's your German word for the day, Bildung. So what is Bildung? Well, the root word is Bild, which means an image. And so I gave you this great image. It's an image by Raphael. It's in the Vatican, of the School of Athens, which is itself an image about education. Bildung can also mean like a formation, like a rock formation, or the shape of a flower. So, what kind of education, then, is Bildung? If you think of the German word Bildung as education, what does that mean? Well, Bildung is an education that forms you. It doesn't just inform you by putting knowledge into your head. It actually forms you. It makes you who you are. Education, it also is Bildung as education transforms you. It changes who you are. It shapes and reshapes your identity. If my students don't have their identity challenged in my classes, I feel I'm not succeeding. It allows you to put complicated things together to form new formations in your mind. Now, that's a lot of meaning for just a little two-syllable word, but that's exactly why learning a foreign language is interesting, because there are words that defy easy translation. So now, one more small step in my talk. If you've got Bildung, or you go through a process of Bildung, in German you are gebildet. That's forming the same kind of past participle as educated, right? You are gebildet. You're educated. So, we know that just substituting one English word for a German word is not that easy. What is it to be gebildet? What is it to be educated in this sense? So now, finally, I get to my love German philosophy. I'm going to talk very briefly about Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a famous German philosopher. How many of you have ever heard of Hegel? Oh, all right. Okay. He's famous for developing dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking is making opposites and contradictions productive for thought, as when you have a dialogue and you go through the process of encountering new and challenging ideas that change you. He's got a reputation for being a really difficult and obscure philosopher, but I'm going to try to make it easy. He wrote a great essay called Who Thinks Abstractly? Now, he begins it by saying abstract thinking seems like it would be really hard, right? You've got to be really smart to think abstractly. You've got to be really educated. But his punchline is really great. He says, who thinks abstractly? The uneducated, not the educated. That is, die Ungebildeten, those who are not educated, not die Gebildeten. So what does that mean for Hegel? What is he saying here? What is Bildung for him? Well, for him it means Bildung, education, is not the ability to speak abstractly, but to speak concretely. And there he's got a sense in his head, I think, of the original Latin meaning concrescere, which means to grow together. Whoops. That is, to be gebildet, to be educated in this sense, is the ability to hold multiple things together in your head at the same time. Right? To do that, one way of doing that is to have multiple languages and cultures in your head at the same time. As we just heard, in fact, in some ways, that's the normal state for us to be in, to have multiple cultures and things and languages in your head at the same time. Now, you've got a little more German in your head at the same time, so now I can hope you can enjoy your own new Bildung. Thank you.
Excellent. It is now Q&A time for John Smith. Well, let's start off with, oh, I know who we could start off with. It's Duncan Shaw from DTS Language Services, the people who sponsored the wine you drank tonight. So, Duncan,
Well, that's great.
I know, this guy's a hero. You work here at the Frontier, your company's based here at the Frontier. I think you have a question, so let's hear it.
Afraid I was going to drop this ball. So, Professor, there's been a big talk in a lot of years about AI with languages and Google Translate. And I just wondered what your take on that was, how that's shaping language. And I also wondered if you can tell the difference if your students are using Google Translate to do their homework.
Oh, that's I think at this point it's not quite yet good enough. I think we can still kind of catch them. But that's a really interesting question. I mean, I know we talked a little bit earlier. I know you're also interested in the humanities. For me, I am a humanities professor. I want to keep the human being into it, although I must confess I also just taught last summer my first online course. So I'm not a dinosaur. I'm still going that route. But for me, there still is something about the human interaction that you have when you learn a language. That really it is a question of, as I talked about Hegel, the notion of dialogue. It's really through dialogue and through that kind of encounter that maybe at some point artificial intelligence will get us there, but I want to keep the human being in the equation.
All right, next question over here. Heads up. Coming in. Boom.
The German concept of Bildung similar to word constructions in English, like similes and metaphors?
It is, and as a matter of fact, I mean, my original project that when I wrote my PhD was on the relationship between the notion of Bildung and actually the rhetorical tradition. So in the rhetorical tradition that started with the Greeks and went through the Romans, to become educated was to become a good speaker. That was the goal of education. And to become a good speaker, it's not something you can learn, as we could use Hegel's phrase, abstractly. To know when to use a good simile, to know when to use a metaphor, is always tied to a particular audience and a particular context. So if you say to me, you know, gee, you've got to give a talk, how should I give it? Well, I can't give that to you. I can't give you an abstract answer. I have to say, who's the audience? What's the context? What are you trying to accomplish? So Bildung, for me, in that sense, does always take into account the rhetorical context, what it means to be a speaker.
All right, last question for Professor Smith over here. Heads up in the blue shirt. I believe you raised your hand. Blue shirt, blue ball. There we go, the cue ball.
Blue ball. John, I love on how you communicate Bildung. My question for you is, what do you find are effective ways to translate a word to another language when the most effective way is not necessarily trying to explain it in words? Are there other better forms of expressing a word, like through an idea, in a creative way that can get the point across?
Yeah, I've done some translating myself, and you know that is the quandary that you're always in. You know, you want to translate something. You know, you get a word like Bildung. You saw all the meanings that are there. So if you're just, you know, you've got a book and, you know, Hegel uses the word Bildung, what you can't just substitute one English word for it. Sometimes I use multiple words for it. Sometimes you want to speak around it. Sometimes you want to be more creative. Sometimes you got to reach for what would be the English colloquial way of expressing that. So you always, in translating, that's the wonderful thing about foreign languages, is that you also encounter the limits of your own language. Right? And so you're always gesturing towards some other means. How do you write around the situation in order to grasp what that concept is that our language might not have one word for?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Professor John Smith, all the way from California.